Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, the climate guy setting the record straight about climate. In this video, I discuss the latest data set to be corrupted by the climate mafia. This is hot off the press. Satellite snafu masked true sea level rise for decades. The numbers didn't add up. Even as Earth grew warmer and glaciers and ice sheets thawed, decades of satellite data seemed to show that the rate of sea level rise was holding steady or even declining. There's a huge red flag in this paragraph. Decades of satellite data seemed to show that the rate of sea level rise was holding steady or even declining. So the authors were upset that their data didn't match already corrupted temperature data and already corrupted ice mass data. The authors are justifying corrupting their own data based on a lack of correlation with already corrupted other people's data. This paragraph here shows another huge problem. The rate of sea level rise is increasing, and that increase is basically what we expected. They just said 2 paragraphs back, decades of satellite data seem to show that the rate of sea level rise was holding steady or even declining. And now they say the rate of sea level rise is increasing. Well, that directly contradicts what they just said. So what they're doing is they're altering data to meet their expectations. Then they come down here and they say, Nevin's team calculated the rate of sea level rise increased from around 1.8 millimeters per year in 1993 to roughly 3.9 millimeters per year today as a result of global warming. It's not due to global warming, it's due to them altering the data to meet their expectations. Revised tallies confirm that the rate of sea level rise is accelerating as Earth warms and ice sheets thaw. This story has fraud written all over it, but before we get into the numbers, let's go back in time a couple weeks. 2 weeks ago, satellite temperatures showed no warming for the last 20 years, while NASA's fake surface temperatures showed a huge amount of warming. But 2 weeks ago, the climate mafia got to Carl Mears at Remote Sensing Systems and got him to change his data. Here it is, June 30th, 2017. Major correction to satellite data shows 140% faster warming since 1998. Let's go back and look at today's story for a minute. Same story from 2 weeks ago. They altered data to meet the needs of the climate mafia. Threatened by cuts in funding, the climate mafia is changing data all over the place. And let's remember that they're doing this data tampering to match the surface temperature record, which has already been tampered with. The lower line is NASA's 2001 version of their global temperature graph, and their upper version is their current 2017 version. So NASA has doubled 1880 to 2000 warming over the last 16 years, and now the satellite temperature data and the satellite sea level data has been tampered with to match the already tampered with temperature data. The level of fraud and malfeasance on display here is simply off scale, but this story gets much worse. NASA has already tampered with the sea level data to double 1880 to 1980 sea level rise. The lower line is NASA's 1982 version of sea level, and the green line is their current version. In their 1982 version, NASA showed little or no sea level rise after 1955, but in their current version, they show an acceleration. There's so many levels of data tampering and fraud on display here, it's taken me years to track all of this down. Now let's look at the actual data and see if there's any justification for the data tampering in the latest study. This is the tide gauge from NOAA in Lower Manhattan, going back to before the Civil War. What this graph shows us is that there's been a constant rate of sea level rise in Lower Manhattan of 2.84 millimeters per year, going back to the time when Lincoln was president. It was 2.84 millimeters per year when Teddy Roosevelt was president. It was 2.84 millimeters per year when Franklin Roosevelt was president. It was 2.84 millimeters per year when Jimmy Carter was president, and it was 2.84 millimeters per year when Obama was president. So where is this supposed more than doubling of sea level rise rates after 1993? We certainly don't see it in Lower Manhattan. Not only is sea level rise not accelerating in Lower Manhattan, but the actual level of the sea is about the same as it was 20 years ago. There's been no sea level rise of Manhattan over the last 20 years. And remember, water seeks a level surface. If the glaciers were actually melting and sea level rise rates had doubled, we would see it at essentially every single tide gauge in the world. We're certainly not seeing it in Manhattan. What about at other tide gauges? Same story at Atlantic City, New Jersey. Sea level is about the same there now as it was 20 years ago. The dashed red line shows the claimed doubling of sea level rise from the new study. Well, it doesn't exist. It's not happening. Now let's look at the west coast of La Jolla, California. Sea level there is about the same as it was 35 years ago. This claimed doubling of sea level rise rates simply isn't happening. It's imaginary. Let's look at one more tide gauge at Stockholm, Sweden. Not only is sea level rise not accelerating there, sea level is actually falling, and it's been falling at a steady rate since the 19th century. If these people at the University of Colorado making these adjustments were honest scientists, they would have looked at the tide gauge data and realized that these corrections were completely bogus. But they're not. Frankly, I'm embarrassed to live in Boulder with all the scientific fraud that goes on here day after day. But now let's look at some more of the science. The authors claim that their data tampering is in line with their expectations about melting polar ice caps. But NASA says that Antarctica is gaining ice rather than losing it. That means that it's causing sea level to fall, not rise. And Greenland's surface has gained a record amount of ice this year, more than 600 billion tons, and it's hardly melting at all. The melt season is almost over. So both Antarctica and Greenland are gaining ice, but the sea level people at the University of Colorado are tampering with their data to match their expectations about non-existent melting ice. It's difficult to imagine that science can get any worse than this, but it does. It gets much worse. If we go to the NOAA sea level page, they say absolute global sea level rise is believed to be 1.7 to 1.8 millimeters per year. That's less than half of what the University of Colorado is claiming. The lower graph shows sea level rise rates at all 233 NOAA tide gauges. These range from about minus 10 millimeters per year up to plus 10 millimeters per year. Only about 10% of their tide gauges show 3.9 millimeters or above. What that tells us is that 90% of tide gauges show less sea level rise than what the University of Colorado is claiming. So you might ask, how does this kind of utter garbage get through peer review? Well, here's the end game. All climate scientists are seeking funding from the same trough. And in order to get that funding, they have to scare people. No scare story, no funding. So this is the kind of garbage they send over to the press. New York and London could be underwater within decades. Scientists say devastating climate change will take place sooner than thought, and then they show a picture of New York underwater. But if we go back to the tide gauge at New York City, we see that there's really nothing happening there. Sea level's been rising at the same rate since Lincoln was president, and there's been no change in sea level over the last 20 years there. This story is completely bunk. It's all about scientists scaring people for funding, and it's not the first time they've pulled this story. Here's the same story from 1934. Will melting icebergs engulf the world? And there they had the same picture of the Empire State Building in Manhattan covered with water. This story has nothing to do with science. It's about raising money for research funding. They repeat these same scare stories over and over and over again. Threatened with funding cuts, climate scientists are tampering with their data left and right. 2 weeks ago was the satellite temperatures. This week it's satellite sea level. And the justification for doing this tampering is to match already massively tampered with surface temperature data sets. What we're seeing is layer upon layer of collusion, junk science, and fraud. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.